When staying at Chawton, if my two cousins, Mary Jane and Cassie, were there, we often had amusements in which my aunt was very helpful. She was the one to whom we always looked for help. She would furnish us with what we wanted from her wardrobe, and she would often be the entertaining visitor in our make-believe house. She amused us in various ways. Once I remember in giving a conversation as between myself and my two cousins, supposed to be grown up, the day after a ball. As I grew older, she would talk to me more seriously of my reading and of my amusements. I had taken early to writing verses and stories, and I am sorry to think how I troubled her with reading them. She was very kind about it and always had some praise to bestow, but at last she warned me against spending too much time upon them. She said, how well I recollect it, that she knew writing stories was a great amusement, and she thought a harmless one, though many people, she was aware, thought otherwise, but that at my age it would be bad for me to be much taken up with my own compositions. Later still, it was after she got to Winchester, she sent me a message to this effect, that if I would take her advice I should cease writing till I was 16, and that she herself had often wished she had read more and written less in the corresponding years of her own life. She was considered to read aloud remarkably well. I did not often hear her, but once I knew her take up a volume of Evelina and read a few pages of Mr. Smith and the Brangtons, and I thought it was like a play. She had a very good speaking voice. This was the opinion of her contemporaries, and though I did not then think of it as perfection, or ever hear it observed upon, yet its tones have never been forgotten. I can recall them even now, and I know they were very pleasant. I have spoken of the family union that prevailed amongst my grandmother's children. Aunt Jane was a very affectionate sister to all her brothers. One of them in particular was her especial pride and delight, but of all her family the nearest and dearest throughout her whole life was undoubtedly her sister, her only sister. Aunt Cassandra was the older by 3 or 4 years, and the habit of looking up to her begun in childhood seemed always to continue. When I was a little girl, she would frequently say to me, if opportunity offered, that Aunt Cassandra could teach everything much better than she could. Aunt Cass knew more. Aunt Cass could tell me better whatever I wanted to know. All which I ever received in respectful silence. Perhaps she thought my mind wanted to turn in that direction, but I truly believe she did always really think of her sister as the superior to herself. The most perfect affection and confidence ever subsisted between them, and great and lasting was the sorrow of the survivor when the final separation was made. My aunt's life at Chawton, as far as I ever knew, was an easy and pleasant one. It had little variety in it, and I am not aware of any particular trials till her own health began to fail. She stayed from home occasionally, almost entirely with the families of her different brothers. In the autumn of 1815 she was in London with my uncle, Mr. Henry Austen, then living in Hans Place, and a widower. During her visit he was seized with a low fever and became so ill that his life was despaired of, and Aunt Cassandra and my father were summoned to the house. There for a day or two they hourly expected his death, but a favourable turn came and he began to recover. My father then went home. Aunt Cass stayed on nearly a month, and Aunt Jane remained some weeks longer to nurse the convalescent. It was during this stay in London that a little gleam of court favour shone upon her. She had at first published her novels with a great desire of remaining herself unknown, but it was found impossible to preserve a secret that so many of the family knew, and by this time she had given up the attempt, and her name had been made public enough, though it was not inserted into the title page. 2 of the great physicians of the day had attended upon my uncle during his illness. I am not at the distance of time sufficiently sure which they were as to give their names. One of them had very intimate access to the Prince Regent, and continuing his visits during my uncle's recovery, he told my aunt one day that the Prince was a great admirer of her novels, and he often read them and had a set in each of his residences, that he, the physician, had told his Royal Highness that Miss Austen was now in London, and that by the Prince's desire Mr. Clarke, the librarian of Carlton House, would speedily wait upon her. Mr. Clark came and endorsed all previous compliments and invited my aunt to see Carlton House, saying that the prince had charged him to show her the library there, adding many civilities as to the pleasure his Royal Highness had received from her novels. 3 had then been published. The invitation could not be declined, and my aunt went at an appointed time to Carlton House. She saw the library and I believe some other apartments, but the particulars of her visit, if ever I heard of them, I have now forgotten. Only this I do well recollect, that in the course of it, Mr. Clark, speaking again of the Regent's admiration of her writing, declared himself charged to say that if Miss Austen had any other novel forthcoming, she was quite at liberty to dedicate it to the prince. My aunt made all proper acknowledgments at the moment, but had no intention of accepting the honour offered, until she was advised by some of her friends that she must consider the permission as a command.